Some out as is. I just got off of 3 days on a middle school charter bus. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Wow. The noise, the free smells, boys really do stink in middle school. And some of the girls are better. That's the sad news. But well, never mind. Sean is here. We can't say anything. So, kidding. Just kidding. I'll be honest. I am extremely discouraged. It was a largely awful trip, to be frank. Yeah, absolutely. The amount of disobedience, lack of respect for authority, is astonishing. Now, Rob's back there going, "Yeah, preach." So I know this, but I didn't sit in it for 3 days. Yeah, wow. A young man who will remain nameless, not from this church, so rest at ease, grandparents. Quite literally did everything you asked him not to do, constantly. Capped it off with buying a "I Love Hot Moms" t-shirt and wanted to wear it. Turn it inside out. At the very end, he wanted to, I don't know what he wanted from me, but he wanted to shake hands and kind of like, "We good?" And I didn't know what to say. My anger, and this is where I struggle. I've got quite the, as my mom would say, Irish temper. So it had been, 6 hours on a bus of, yeah, Roy's laughing, screaming, smelly kids, and he wants to just, "Oh, we're all good, right?" And I took his hand and I said, "I don't know. If you're looking for praise from me for being the worst behaved kid in this whole trip, you're not going to get it." And then we turned and walked away, and then he said something, the last comment. "Okay, bud." Bang, zoom to the moon, Alice, right? That was the, oh, mercy, gets my blood up right now. Discouraging. Interestingly enough, God does have a sense of humor. Part of our topic today is the decline of authority. So fitting. Didn't know God was setting me up on a middle school bus, but I should have seen that one coming. Yeah, Roy's going, duh. All right. As normal, you got the first page, which is a summary, catches you up a little bit on where we've been. So, make a paper airplane out of that first part, whatever you want to do. Let's put on our imaginations here this morning. Some of this will be a little bit of review if you've been not sleeping during class. But walk back to the 14th century and imagine what it was like for your ancestors. Give me some thoughts that come to mind. What was life like for your ancestors? Whether that's in Norway, mine were in Scotland or Ireland or Germany, wherever. Sweden, sorry for the Swedes in here. So, what was life like? Poor, barefoot, okay. Cold homes, you betcha. There we go, no bus. But he wasn't born way that quite. You're not that quite old, Roy. But yes, no bus, you betcha. All manual labor, nothing mechanized in the 14th century. So if your blacksmith didn't have the means to make it or you didn't, you were crafting stuff by hand. What other thoughts come to mind? Lack of food at times, for sure. People didn't fixate on their hopes and dreams. Why not, Chris? Why was it impossible to fixate on your hopes and dreams? Okay, so the point I think you're making is because maybe say it in a different way, Chris. Give me a better angle on that. Okay, so we have such prosperity, such opportunity for expansion, for climbing the ladder in whatever craft we're at, and that just wasn't even on the radar, was it? And they didn't have radar back then. Okay. Oh boy. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. When did you have leisure time back in the 14th century? Right. Disease, short lifespan, incredible childbirth deaths. I mean, you praised the Lord if your kids outlived you. Um, did your wife survive childbirth? Yeah. Shoot, Doug. just trying to survive. Yeah, Maslow's pyramid was not even on the radar. And you were in one of three classes. You remember the three estates? Anybody want to help me out? The three estates, the three general structures of society? Who's at the top? The king. King's at the top. Who's next? The priests, the Pope and the priests, right? And you didn't have a choice, by the way. You were Catholic or you weren't. It was the small c, Catholic or world Christian church. Unless you lived in Greece and then you were Orthodox. That split happened in the 11th century, if my memory's right. Not sure what that was. Okay, and then the rest of us fall into what? The peasantry, right? Unless you've got an ancestor who wore a crown in the distant past, you were peasants. Anything else come to mind? Living in the 14th century, back in the old country. Oh, good, Patty. If you weren't born into wealth, you weren't going to get there. Certainly on your own. There was no way. There was no avenue, was there? There was no capitalism. Oh, yeah. 3 days of that on the bus, Gary. You're right. Hygiene. Hygiene. Yeah. Where'd you take a bath? Right? What did you use to get yourself to smell somewhat presentable? Perfumes were invented, obviously, for very good reasons. So, yeah. Yes.
One thing I thought was interesting, the author pointed out, but 5, maybe 10 years old, you'd already met your spouse.
Right. So you didn't travel very far, maybe not more than a couple miles. If you were closer to an urban city, London, you might go in maybe once a year with your dad. But yeah, you probably met your spouse before you thought that was even something you were interested in. Other thoughts on 14th century, very little education. There was no mass production of texts, you're right. The printing press wasn't mass producing texts. So if you didn't have the means to buy a handwritten book, you were out of luck. Many of the priests were frankly poorly educated. Some of the friars were better educated and the monks in the clerical, but some of the priests were really just no better off than you. Thus, you love to see the cathedrals and all the stained glass, right? That was part of your education. Those pictures were instructional. We think of them as just beautiful, and we know the artistry going into those things, but it was also instructional. Closing comments, 14th century life. What else comes to mind? Wow. ABC, NBC. Yeah. Can you tell what Bob's field of work is? How much do you think were you farming? Huh. David? Yeah, maybe 5 or 10 acres. Who owned it? No, not the government, the king, right? Oh, yeah, technically. Thank you, Sandy. You're right. Yeah, not the government as we think of Big Brother, but literally the king owned it, and you paid him whatever that tithe, whatever that percentage was, and yeah, maybe a couple acres at most, and that was all you could do with hopefully a couple boys that the Lord gave you that survived that could help you, right? Yeah, Gare. Sure. Yep. Somebody says, "Hey, Rachel's a witch and she can't disprove it," and they burn her at the stake, right? And maybe we should keep that in mind too. In a feudal society, you offend the king, you forfeit your life. You offend the king, your offense is based on the authority and the level of the person you offend, not on the actual crime. So you offend the king, you forfeit your life. We even see that in the Bible, don't we? Esther risking her life to save her Jewish people, knowing she was coming in a dangerous position, just a little bit out of step, and it could be off with the head. Any other thoughts before we move on? My point in this one is to get our brains going here, because Lord, I need it. I got home late and got up early. We tend to focus on the negatives, don't we? And when we think about 14th century life, because we have it so good. One of the benefits of that life was it was very fixed, very stable. There were no big life questions because they weren't even on the radar. You weren't worried about your career. It was decided for you. You weren't worried about who you were going to marry. It may be a little bit, but that was probably fairly well laid out before you were ready to get married. You weren't worried about your profession. Things were incredibly secure. You knew who your father was, your mother, and their parents. You saw the graves, all of those things. Incredibly stable, fixed, not safe, because any of the men could be called to take up arms to defend for the king, right? Not necessarily safe, but in some ways, psychologically, very stable. Utterly different, right, than our day and age, isn't it? Utterly different. Walking around the cities this past, with the kids, I don't envy at all our kids who are faced with so many stressful decisions. And now, as we're unpacking, even the decision about what should my gender and sex be, it's crushing. All of that, it's hard enough for some of us remember the decisions we made career-wise and how difficult that was. And some of us have made multiple career decisions. That's fairly common now, 3, 4, maybe even 6. But now add in your very most intimate part, your sexuality is now something you've got to figure out if you haven't been told otherwise. It's crushing. No wonder we have so many problems and need for counseling. So we've kind of, I hope, solidified, pun and partly intended, a solid, stable world. The author argues we've moved into what he calls a plastic world, a world that is now much more moldable. Apply a little heat and you can change it. You can mold it into whatever you want. And he argues this is based off of the collapse of traditional authority. So this is your next page, I believe. The loss of sacred order and, for lack of a better term, frankly, just technology. So let's go through these in order. And if you're a note taker and you don't have a pen, raise a hand and we'll get you a pen. Where did my obnoxious mug go full of all the pens? It's around here somewhere. It says world's greatest boss on there. Why are you laughing? All right, so collapse of traditional authority. The big three. These are what we're going to unpack right now. The church, the family, and the nation. Thank you, Kevin. The church, the family, and the nation. And we'll do a compare and contrast. 14th century, I mentioned it. You're Roman, you're Catholic. Okay, unless you're in Greece, maybe parts of Russia by that point, then you're Orthodox. But you probably have never heard of a Muslim. You've probably never heard of a Buddhist or a Hindu unless you happen to live in an area geographically where that was an issue. So by that time, probably the Muslims or Saracens were known because of the Crusades. And I don't pretend to remember when all the Crusades happened. But part of the Crusades was just simply to keep the Muslims from conquering Europe. So you've got the church. What wasn't an option back then, now, how many options do we have? Up-teen options, including the most popular option these days, it seems, or the growing option, which is no church. Completely unchurched. Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher, wrote a really, really impactful book. A lot of people I look up to have read it several times, called A Secular Age. And he says, this is probably, he says, this is definitely a first in history, of world history, where you could wake up, Ben could wake up and be raised in an utterly secular environment. Previously, and we've talked about some of these authors, Freud, and you were raised in a Christian environment and you had to reject that. So you knew the basic tenets of the Christian faith because it was all around you. It was the majority view, and then you had to kind of toughen yourself and then push it off. But now that can actually be totally flipped. So you can be raised in a completely secular environment, having never stepped foot in a church, never opened a Bible, and be taught that that's actually evil. In other words, this is the most dangerous thing in the world. And he argues, find another time in history where that was the case. He says, do your anthropology. Every culture had some religious view, as wicked as it might have been. Those beautiful totem poles that we see told them to do some pretty horrible child sacrificing things, but it was religious. It was something sacred. And he's saying we have stepped into wholly new territory in history. It's crazy. It's scary. And it's daunting. How do you make a connection with somebody who doesn't share any of that vocabulary? So you'll hear pastors or apologists talk about you have to have pre-evangelism discussions. Let's at least set up a shared vocabulary that there could be a creator. Okay, well, what do you mean by that? Somebody who has a design, right? An intelligent design argument is a way to bridge that gap, maybe. So not only do we have the first, he would say, ever option to just not choose church at all, but then there's everything in between, right? We have our evangelical Christianity. You have your liberal, which really isn't Christianity, but kind of looks like it. You've got Buddhists, you've got Muslims, you've got Sikhs, and the list goes on, right? As we have grown in being able to explore the universe and our world, those religions are now all options, and you get to pick and choose. It's plastic. It's flexible. 2, family has collapsed. And he notes several things I wrote down too I wanted to focus on, and this is not picking on anybody who's gone through a divorce, but it is easy to get a divorce. It's just a fact, isn't it? Allison could say, I'm sick of Kevin. It's grounds for divorce. And again, not picking on anybody here who's been through the horrible tragedy of a divorce. But it is easy. 14th century, what do you think? Yeah, I don't even know if I've read anything on that. Frankly, I don't know. I don't really think it was an option. Unto death do we part. So that's changed things. We agree? It's changed things. Yeah, Roy, shoot. Absolutely. Great point. So Roy brings up a great point. So let's say his darling bride, Loretta's like, boy, I'm sick of Roy. But he's the moneymaker, so I got to stick around because there's no means for Loretta. Loretta, she can't make it on her own. But now, yes, we have 2-income families, et cetera, right? You can opt out. So it's made a profound change, hasn't it, on the family? We have also the ability to control the size of our family. One of the other chaperones was a mom of way more than six kids, which is rare for us. Allison and I, typically when people say, oh, you have 6 kids, there's the, oh, wow. What's our national average? It's pretty low. Actually, I think we're negative now. I think we have a negative birth rate. Right. So we are like 2 point, I don't know. We're under that, just under that. Most of Europe has a negative birth rate by far. And frankly, in our country, the Mormons are helping us out, and that's not a good thing. So at any rate, birth control. Birth control has had a huge impact on us, hasn't it? And we're going to unpack that a little bit more, but think about it in the context of the family. You now have the ability to control how many kids you want. Yo.
Even 100 years ago, didn't have to be a farmer, it could be maybe someone who owned a business. The wars that the children did, they maybe affect the survival of the family or the business. If you were a dairy farmer, you were definitely have that. Now our kids have to clean their room, dump the garbage. I think it's affected what they feel.
Okay, so Doug's saying, and this is for the tape, maybe more than for everybody else. I hope that tape's on, by the way. So your self-worth as a child has changed profoundly with the loss of the need to do chores and contribute to the business. He used the example of farming, if you couldn't hear him. Now, you got to set up we have a chore chart at our house, or we used to. Hey, this is your day, you got to do this. This is your day, you got to. Now, do we need to do that to survive? No, for some sanity, yeah. Kids want some privileges? Okay, well, do your chores. But it wasn't an option back then, right? And if you had a bunch of boys as a farmer, boy, you were happy, right? The blacksmith obviously would hope for that son to take up the trade. Otherwise, he would look for somebody else who had a lot of boys, and that boy would apprentice under him. So family. Church has been destabilized and is very much changed. Yeah, that clock is not working, is it? I just realized. So we'll look at my clock here. The nation has also changed, hasn't it? Now, nation states are relatively new, but I mean, just think of our country. Just think in our memory. Well, before our memory, the Civil War, what an impact that had on our country. What an impact that had on our country. World War I and World War II. The impact that it had around the world, right? World War I was the Great War. That was supposed to be the war that what? Ended all wars. And then a couple decades later, it's not just another war, it is exponentially more destructive. Huge impact. We could unpack that for a while. Just in German thought. Oh. And then 1960s, let's go more recent history, a little bit before my time, right? The seeds of distrust with Nixon and the Vietnam War. What are our boys doing over there? What are we doing to people over there? Agent Orange. I met a man who survived a phosphorus grenade. Getting into the lake didn't help. He boiled the lake. Yeah. We made those things to use on our enemies, and it got him. He was a believer, by the way. One of the first testimonies I ever heard as a high school student was this guy who was so ugly. He was physically marred, and he was hard to look at. But boy, he loved Jesus. It was cool. So a lot of distrust that began in the 60s and has really contributed to the collapse of our trust of authority, hasn't it? And here's where I want to make sure I got to stay on track here, which is hard for me. I'm a little tired. This has happened on both sides of the political aisle. And I like what Carl Trueman points out here. Whether you're a, quote, liberal or conservative, we have a pretty healthy distrust of Big Brother and government. Now, the left seems to like more and more government control, whatever, but they have a distrust of other things. There's been a destabilization in our trust of authorities, of corporate authorities, on both sides of the aisle politically, and it's having an impact. So the family is not what it once was. The nation is not what it once was. The church or your religion is no longer nearly as stable or as simple. 2, he points out then the loss of the sacred order. So as I kind of talked about earlier, there was always in culture, anthropologically speaking, an external reason for your moral decisions. In other words, what was right or what was wrong was based off of some other larger authority. So if you were the Mayans, whatever god they worshipped, which was not our God, the real God, that was their justification for why you could sacrifice your kid or you couldn't. And it created a sense of moral structure. Well, in a growing secular environment, where do we derive our morals from? What do you think? Where do we derive our morals from? If the growing populace in our country, and we can go to Europe too, where do we derive our discernment of what is right and wrong if God is being removed from the picture? What are your thoughts? Okay, government. So we look to that structure, but if we don't trust the government, which is definitely an issue, especially for our country, what are our resources for? Oh, ourself. Okay, let's flesh that out, or some other thoughts. Popular opinion, a collection of selves, right? So, which way is the wind blowing? And that's what we follow. Pop culture and the media, a similar idea, right? So whatever's being most communicated most often is therefore true in a small t sense, right? And again, let me explain what I mean by that. A capital T truth is a truth that is based off of, we would say the Bible, for example, that is, it's objective. It is true whether I believe it or not. It is outside of my experience. It is true whether I deny it or not, right? That's a big T, an absolute, we would say, truth. But here we're talking about these kind of the idea of a little t truth. What's true for you? What's true for me? So a collection of selves, popular opinion. In our days, boy, mass communication. How much is the TV and social media shaping what we view to be right or wrong? It's a sobering thought, no matter what side of the political aisle you're on. It is a sobering thought. So, the loss of the sacred order, as he points out, means that we no longer have an agreed upon view of Christianity shaping our moral structure, our moral backbone. That's been removed. It's been deboned, so to speak. Some thoughts back there? Nope. Okay. The sacred, in fact, he argues, there's a sense in which our culture is, in a strange way, afraid of religions, of theocracies, of dictators who claim a God and then want to conquer the world with that God. And then he points out, and this is a nerdy term, but I want you to tuck it away, or if you're a note taker, write it down. It's called the double hermeneutic effect. Okay, what do you mean? The double hermeneutic effect. It's the idea that the models that we create to explain society, we don't realize how those models actually influence how society behaves. It's an unintentional, in theory, secondary cause. So I shape a model to say, hey, my family functions like a ship. And without intending to, that model actually influences how my family behaves, which is not its intended purpose, but it is a result. So sociology is reckoning with, at least those that will admit it, this is part of the problem they're creating. How they're describing our culture is actually shaping, or it's the idea of cognitive dissonance. It's personality tests are a great example of this. Okay, you take a personality test. So who's taking the Myers-Briggs? Come on, that's old enough, right? So I'm an extrovert, okay? So when I feel introverted, there's a part of me that tells myself that's not right. I have cognitive dissonance. I have this sense of, wait, I thought I was in this box and I need to stay in that box. I'm letting that test define who I am. It's the problem, inherent problem, not always bad, but the inherent problem with personality tests, including, name any of them, right? There's that cognitive dissonance. There's that sense in which it's interpreting me, and it's gotten out of hand. The tool is doing more than it should be. Does that make sense? It's good to know, because this is how we need to filter the news, by the way, folks. The news is doing this to us. It's supposed to be objective and telling us what it sees, but at the same time, it's shaping us to see how they see. So I don't know who, maybe the elders and I were talking about this, I don't remember, but this is where, be careful what's discipling you. Odds are what's discipling you is what you spend the most time with. It's shaping you. It's shaping you. This is where having a healthy distrust of news and social media, and I'm not saying go full-blown conspiracy, okay? But if there ever is a zombie apocalypse, I'm going over to Abercrombie's house. Yes?
It's also in arts and entertainment too.
Yeah.
Does art follow culture?
Yes. So culture and art, yes, very much so. One author argued years ago, visual art is often the most progressive, the most prophetic. It's typically ahead of culture, whereas music is a little regressive and follows. So movies are often pushing the gambit, pushing to where we are today. I just rewatched one of the Matrix movies. Whoa. So, which brings up technology. And we've got about 10 minutes before we close in prayer. So technology. We read some of these guys a couple weeks ago that are just yucky. Marx and Nietzsche and Freud and Reich. Their ideologies were somewhat impossible until technology enabled them. So it's one thing for Reich to say, yeah, blow up the family and do what you want to do and create your own morals. Well, that was impossible, as Roy pointed out. Loretta couldn't do that, in the 14th century because she's relying on him. There wasn't the technology and the job structure for her to be able to have that independence, but now she does. Now, we know Loretta won't do that. She loves Roy. Roy loves Loretta. Okay? Praise God. Amen. That's right. And by God's grace. Amen? Amen. But technology has enabled so much these days. Let's think about it. Let's start with contraception. It's one thing to talk about sexual, casual sex, but even, 200 years ago or 100 years ago, you knew the consequence, right? Ladies, you knew the consequence. I really like this guy. Oh, I can't get pregnant. My parents would chuck me out of the house. How am I going to provide for myself? Well, would the priest even marry us? The cost was so high, you just couldn't do it. Well, then comes the condom. Oh, wait, now we can. And then comes the birth control pill. And then comes easy abortion. You see, technology has enabled some of these things that previously it wasn't that we didn't want it, we just couldn't accomplish it, right? 50 years ago, incredible. Was it 50, maybe 60 when we landed on the moon? What year was that? Who knows that? 69, thank you, okay? And now I think we'll see somebody on Mars before I die. Technology is enabling that. I'm sure we could agree on some people we'd like to ship to Mars. Ship wouldn't be big enough. So, oh well. No, I'm kidding. All right. Some of those kids on the bus, it'd have been Lord of the Flies. They'd have killed them all. Oof. Wow. It's going to be hard for that not to come up in my sermon today, by the way. All right. This is, again, going down technology. I do really like movies, by the way, because they are progressive. And, I got to skip my stuff and mute stuff because of the gross stuff. But there's a movie, and I think it's called Her. It's Joaquin Phoenix, who's a strange dude, needs Jesus for sure. He buys into this personalized AI for his computer, and he falls in love with it. Now, bizarre, but he falls in love with it. She's made for him. He had to answer this really detailed survey. It's custom made for everything he would ever want in a woman. She asks all the right questions, makes all the right compliments. He has his own personal, not real, we know this, but kind of digital wife. Technology is doing that. This is why pornography is so rampant. It's a struggle for some of us in this room. And not just men, by the way. Not just men. The author, this is worth noting, says, what pornography does is it creates a performance of sex instead of making love. I think he's really, really right. I always thought that term as a kid was kind of strange, that sex was making love. I'm married, I get it. And I know we don't like to talk about these things in church, but we need to. But pornography removes that. It's now about bodies and about performance, not about faces and relationship and intimacy that only two people should share. It's about performance and not about love. And it is sad how many kids are now tempted to, part of the dating and, quote, courtship process is, I will take a nude selfie of myself to show you. Do you like what you see? Do you like what you see? Because it's a performance. Technology has enabled a lot of things. Anything else come to mind? I haven't covered them all. I stuck where Truman stuck here a little bit on the sexual part of it. But are there some other technologies that we can see having a negative impact on us culturally? Okay, technology has enabled a lot more secrecy. Yes, secrets, and it's really removed privacy, hasn't it? Some guy who was lonely in the hotel wanted to talk to me when I just wanted my coffee and Bible, but he basically removes spy stuff from cars. What does he call? What do you say? He'll bring a car into his shop and he'll set up a fake tower and a fake router, and then he'll isolate if there's any other tracking devices on the vehicle. Because by the way, yeah, Big Brother can do that to you. It's nuts. So privacy is also out the window. Any other negatives for technology? Because we're going to now close with, well, so what, Kevin? I'm going to skip the revolt of the elites. The basic idea in that premise is this: if we don't trust authority structures and institutions, who do we trust? We trust the elites. We trust those who are the most vocal or influential. Elon Musk. Pick the who was the guy at Fox who just got canned? Yep. Okay. We trust Tucker Carlson, for good or bad. That's actually replaced our authority structure, because we don't trust authorities anymore. We don't trust institutions. They're somehow inherently corrupt, because Marx says, right, just power is always corrupting. So, for good or bad, we tend to be trusting these influential, very select few people on our side, and not institutions. And thus the church is suffering greatly, because I'm just considered part of the man, part of the, whatever. So how do we live? Is where I want us to at last close here and think about a little bit. So I want to touch on three things. If authority, as we I think we agree, is declining, and the respect of authority especially is declining, how are you going to combat that in your family and in your kids' family? Okay, Mark points to the Bible. Yep, okay. Sure. Let's get a little more specific there, Mr. Abercrombie. What do you mean? Mark says, I don't want to talk, Kevin. Don't put me in the spot. Okay, the Bible. So we would teach our children that there is a greater authority. Is that what you're getting at, Mark? Okay, there's a greater authority even than mom and dad. Okay. Okay. Yep. Okay, so a good, not perfect, but a good model of a family is mom and dad have authority that is not to be questioned. It's there because we love you. We wish to keep you safe and protect you and provide for you. And if we can establish that smaller model, then we can blow that out to, your teachers have that care for you. You should respect the teachers. You should be able to then respect your pastors, the adults that you see in the neighborhood, Gary, your neighbor, right? And then there's this, because of course, underneath that all is there's a God, right? Who is the ultimate authority for all of us. I don't think it's a light thing to think about. I think it's really important. How are you helping your kids and your grandkids to understand the truth of actual authority? And that it is needed for so many reasons. Not to mention that heaven and hell is on the line. If you don't believe in authority, I don't know how you can believe Jesus is Savior and Lord. Because he's ultimately in the authority, isn't he? While we're stewing on that, how can you help, and how can you create an environment at home that has a sacred order? Surely the Bible, but how?
Limit some of those other.
Okay, so you limit some of the other influencers like? Okay. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And for your kids, that'd be, whoever on YouTube or whatever, you're carving out time. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Nathan, for?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
They spend on it. They're influenced by it.
Yeah.
I've listened to a couple lectures by the author.
Mm-hmm.
He gets that question. If there's a Q&A, he gets the question, what do we do?
Yeah, how do we live? How do we? Yep.
Points out family.
You start with your family. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Model it. As far as technology goes, the one thing that he mentions that he does point out is he suggests never giving a smartphone.
So that didn't pick up on the camera. The author's request or answer to some lectures that Nathan has listened to is, don't ever give your kid a smartphone. I'm not bragging, but I think my son was one of 2 kids on the bus who didn't have a smartphone. And I felt kind of bad for him because he was an outsider.
Well, yeah, even ask for smartphones.
Yes, they want smartphones, right? And it seems neutral in some ways, doesn't it, parents? I mean, if we're honest, it's just a phone. I mean, technology isn't inherently good or bad, but it needs a lot of wisdom, doesn't it? How do you, as a kid, have wisdom in using a phone that could lead you into all sorts of, what did Bob call it? Evil. The devil, yeah. 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 We've got three main enemies in our life. Remember that, biblically speaking: the devil, the world, and our own heart. 3 enemies. And that's Prometheus's fire there with the phone. So something to think about. Again, I'm not, and I don't think Nathan is, trying to be legalistic, like thou shalt not have smartphones, although I wanted to chuck mine out the window yesterday. If you text me a lot, I don't like you, by the way. That just drives me nuts. But anyhow, authority, sacred order. This is where, for me, and this is where I'm going to be transparent. I'm trying more as a dad and a pastor, but as a dad, just to have more family devotions at our house. We don't do it enough. Shauna will tell you that. But we try to have dinner together without a device and a devotion. Dinner together without a device. Now, that seems like a really pathetic lowest common denominator. And part of me says, boy, you're weak, Kevin. But trying to just start there and build something. Trying to start there, pray, break open the Word, and get that rhythm. You heard me mention, just by the way, one of my heroes, Rosaria Butterfield, who was a very committed, as we mentioned last week, lesbian in a lesbian quote unquote marriage, came to know Jesus by the grace and the service of this PCA pastor who had her and her quote wife over for dinner all the time, and they prayed every meal. And they read the Word. You're invited to their house. Here, this is what we're going to do. Is that, oh yeah, that's fine. And just, it's part of their practice. They weren't putting on a show. It was part of what they do. We're inviting you into our family. The witness of the family, the hospitality. Her third book is The Gospel Has a House Key. So if the most controversial and attractive part of your life is your family, then practice hospitality. Have people over. Have people over. Just invite them in. Throw some burgers on and have them over. Well, I think that I'll just use my family as an example. I once got rebuked by a woman. She said, "You've got too many kids. What are you doing?" She said this to me. Now, she was drinking during the day, by the way, but whatever. And she was just downright mean and rude. But she believed that I was contributing to overpopulation, I think was her argument. It's like, lady, I haven't even met you. And I won't tell you what I said next. But anyhow, so it's controversial, I think, in some ways, Chris, when we have lots of kids and we have a traditional family. I think it's just so bizarre these days that you might sit down with your kids, TV's off, phones are off, have a meal, pray. And I think it's an incredible witness, because for some, imagine that classmate of Thomas's who's never been in a church. Mom and dad's marriage maybe never was, right? Or blew up really early or whatever. They're walking into something that's just so foreign to them. What is this? But something's attractive. I mean, it's part of how I came to know Jesus. From a broken home, walking into this loving family, I can still see the dad. Come for dinner. We'll play cards afterwards. I stayed there for hours. It wasn't because of the truth, but I saw it lived. I just saw it lived. Technology is the hard part, I think, for us as parents and as even as adults. And I know our time is climbing to a close here. We can talk more about this, and if you want to debate more or just get some suggestions, there's plenty of material trying to give some wisdom and a Christian perspective on how to handle technology, especially I'm thinking of our young parents here, because you're already there, you're already thinking about it. How do we do it? And maybe you're struggling with it. That's the first step. If you're struggling with it, ask the Lord, help me. And it's a struggle for me. I'm a guy, I'm visual. I like seeing things flip on a page and, bang Zoom and all that stuff. So we need to close here for time. Let me pray. Lord, if I talk too much, forgive me for that, Lord. May what we have talked about, though, what is true and what is helpful, may it bear fruit in our lives. Help us to be countercultural for Jesus. And that's key there. Help us not just to be countercultural, to be sarcastic, or to be, full of memes and funny, goofy, whatever. Help us to be countercultural for you, Jesus. Help us to see the mission field, to make and pray and seek wisdom in your word and the hard decisions that we make as parents, grandparents, singles, regarding authority, your word, technology, and use us. Use us to be light in what it seems to be an ever increasingly dark world. And you get all the glory, Jesus. We pray in your name. Amen.